When a motorcycle manufacturer makes a bold claim in their advertising, whether it's something about this new model's performance or maybe how this motorcycle will make you feel, we take it with a grain of salt, unless it's coming from Honda. So when the world leader announced a new bike for the 1978 year with the statement, "First into the future," years before the Back to the Future movies, by the way, the world waited in anticipation. What did Honda have up its sleeve? And more importantly, what the heck is a motorcycle from the future going to look like when you're living in 1978? Today we're looking at the development of one of Honda's craziest and strangest motorcycles ever, the CX. Today, our understanding of what constitutes a big, powerful motorcycle is entirely skewed by the crazy times we live in. A time where 750s are considered beginner bikes and anything making less than 100 horsepower apparently isn't enough to safely traverse our roads, as though the primary place where trouble arises for motorcyclists is in those moments where you need to get on the power, not when you're just piddling through an intersection or allowing all that power to get you into trouble. But there was a time not that long ago when 500s and 650s really ruled the streets. A time when companies like Triumph could put a sticker on their 50 horsepower motorcycle stating, "For the expert rider only." But despite taking over the big sport bike market at the end of the 60s and into the 70s with the CB750, Honda found themselves behind the other big Japanese manufacturers by the mid-70s when it came to middleweight street bikes. At that point, they were offering basically just the CB550 in a few forms, while companies like Yamaha, for example, had multiple 2- and 4-stroke options in this class. Through the 60s and 70s, the battle for market dominance among the Japanese manufacturers centered around 2- and 4-stroke development, carried over primarily from Grand Prix racing. And as 2-strokes slowly creeped up the smallest to the middle and largest classes of what was then MotoGP, so too they began to dominate the off-road segments and really every class for the street. Honda had relented and made their first and wildly successful 2-stroke dirt bike known as the Elsinore, but they'd remained pretty stubborn when it came to street bikes, and for the high-end, top-level sport bikes, this would all come to a head in the ridiculous 6-cylinder 4-stroke behemoth known as the CBX. Around the same time, though, Honda began cooking up something entirely new and entirely different for that growing middle-class segment, and differentiation was really key at this point, as many began to view Japanese motorcycles as somewhat boring. This was about the time that the term universal Japanese motorcycle was starting to be thrown around. Basically, people were starting to accuse the Japanese manufacturers of essentially just continually copying each other and making kind of the same bikes. And at this time, other manufacturers, especially from Europe, were beginning to gain traction. Companies like BMW and, more importantly for this video, Moto Guzzi. Well, people were finding that there were other kinds of motorcycles that maybe weren't quite as quality or quite as reliable, but they were different and they offered some fun, different aspects of riding. So Honda set out to make a motorcycle whose form would, in a sense, transcend that old 2-stroke, 4-stroke war and simultaneously propel them into the future by being entirely different than anything else available. To bring this radical new 500cc motorcycle to production, Honda gave the project's reins to legendary designer Soichiro Irimajiri. I'm sure if you know Honda's history, you know who the man himself is, Soichiro Honda, but this is actually a different Soichiro. Irimajiri was a man who, like Soichiro Honda, wasn't afraid to take risks, responsible for many of Honda's greatest motorcycles ever, including the GL1000 Goldwing, and in this case more recently, the 6-cylinder CBX. But this would not only be a different kind of motorcycle from everything else available in its class, it would really go in a completely different direction for Honda. Irimajiri decided that for this motorcycle, Honda would throw off the yoke of their history and make an entirely new, futuristic design. At the heart of the motorcycle was a liquid-cooled 80-degree V-twin powering the rear wheel via shaft drive. This wasn't the first production liquid-cooled motorcycle. It wasn't even Honda's first liquid-cooled bike. As you probably know, that was the Goldwing. But a V-twin from Honda? And not just any V-twin, a longitudinally mounted V-twin a la Moto Guzzi, and not Harley or Ducati. There had been this kind of V-twin, obviously from companies like Moto Guzzi, but even in early Japanese bikes, think the likes of a company called Lilac. But it's pretty clear who Honda was really taking aim at with this form. It was companies like Moto Guzzi and even BMW. But they decided to make this V-twin 80 degrees instead of the typical 90 degrees to give the rider more space. And this did present multiple challenges for the company, mainly having to do with balancing the machine. But that sharper angle did make for better leg space for riders versus companies like Moto Guzzi. And after a bit of research, the team decided to also tilt the engine forward 22 degrees to give more room for the carburetors. To counter the rocking tendency of a longitudinally mounted V-twin, Honda decided to bring over the GL-style balancing system. Basically, the clutch and the transmission rotated in the opposite direction of the engine, making the bike incredibly smooth for a V-twin. Compared to an enclosed shaft drive, the main goal with this bike was really a new level of comfort and smoothness that no one had really seen in this middleweight class. On top of all this, Honda decided to make the engine and transmission a stressed member. In the end, it was really pretty innovative stuff for this time. But the more you dig into this CX500, the more it gets confusing, because instead of being overhead cam, which was just what Honda was doing for their larger bikes, the form and specifically the tilt of this engine forced Honda to go with a stubby pushrod setup versus their typical overhead cam setup. Honda knew well how to make overhead valve engines, as they were still making them for their smaller bikes, but how could this be a motorcycle of the future if it was reverting back to overhead valves? Sure, it may have been the first production motorcycle to feature things like tubeless tires, but when you put it all together, the package kind of just seems to feel a bit odd. In terms of specs, the bike was competitive, making some 48 horsepower at 9,000 RPM, which is really impressive for a pushrod engine. It had a remarkable 10-to-1 compression, which was really on par with any other production motorcycle from this time, and it powered slightly past 100 miles per hour in terms of top speed. It was pretty heavy for a 500, tipping the scales at almost 450 dry, and this engine and transmission setup did give the bike kind of an odd stance. And this brings us to the looks. It was kind of like a Moto Guzzi and one of Honda's super sports from this time had, an odd looking little motorcycle baby. It's pretty clear Honda wanted to depart from the classic design cues with this futuristic motorcycle. And so gone were the spoked wheels and loads of chrome accents and the overall just straight, simple classic lines, and instead it had a sloping tank and a curvy thick seat, all coupled with a more what they thought was modern gauge cluster, and this strange looking engine made for just such a odd looking motorcycle in Honda's lineup versus all their other CB models. And many found the engine to be ugly, which isn't really what you want for a motorcycle that is really built around its engine and a motorcycle that has the engine as kind of the showcase of the bike. Some reviewers said it looked like an air compressor, which in one sense isn't too far off, but honestly I think it's a really beautiful engine from Honda and I think it's aged well. But what was going on with this motorcycle and why did Irimajiri make all of these decisions? Why the shaft drive? Why the V-twin? Why the thick cushy seat? What is going on with this middleweight motorcycle from the 70s that just simply didn't look like everything else available? The best place to get an understanding about Honda's motivations and goals is to simply look at their advertising. They've always just kind of spelled out what they're trying to accomplish with any given model. It's rarely vague, and I really do appreciate this. The original First Into the Future ad for the CX500 talks about how its potential riders could use the bike. On the one hand, long distance rides, but then on the other, you've got the potential for sporty backroad riding. That was really the package. Check out this ad from 1979, shortly after the original CX was released. Honda calls it the toast of the middleweight sports touring scene, with features meant to make it low maintenance and comfortable. And this ad goes on about how smooth and effortless the ride of the motorcycle is. This kind of all paints a picture of really the goal being to make a new kind of middleweight touring bike. As we noted, most of the Japanese offerings in and around this class were really pure performance machines. They were either high-revving multi-cylinder 4-strokes, many of them were also manic 2-strokes that were very powerful or almost too powerful for their own good. Soichiro Irimajiri made the executive decisions to make this motorcycle so different than what the other manufacturers were offering, with the simple goal of making a middleweight touring bike. The V-twin setup was intended to give the motorcycle a more suitable riding experience for not only riding for fun, but also doing long distance riding. Liquid cooling was quieter and more suitable to all forms of riding, both high speed and also traffic riding, and everything else really served the overall maintenance and comfortability. But the big question is, did this work? Typically, I transition these videos to a detailed explanation of how and why the motorcycle just went on to be a wholesale failure. And certainly this motorcycle had all the makings of just another too radical or even misguided Honda project. And it's true that everyone was a bit confused by this bike when the spy shots first came out. Okay, I don't know if there were spy shots back then, but you get what I'm saying. Despite its sheer oddness, there was no denying it, Irimajiri had made another great, and unlike the CBX, this motorcycle would be a sales success. The CX turned out to be fantastic at exactly what Honda had advertised it for. Around town, it was quiet, it was smooth, it just kind of rumbled along. It was very sophisticated, but once intentions were changed and the throttle was opened up, the bike really came alive. Cycle World describes the power as being really linear and the handling as tight and responsive, and CXs would sell in droves, also in part to its pretty low price tag of $1,900, which wasn't too much more than Yamaha's purposefully dated SR500, which was looking back just as much as this bike was looking forward, and in terms of competition, it was for the most part right on par with many of the best 500s from Yamaha and Suzuki, but it was playing a different game. It truly was a middleweight sport tourer unlike anything before it. And over time, it would become an even more beefed up tourer, not only in capacity, but also in features with a full fairing and just more touring features. And like most tourers, it also didn't really get any prettier, but who cares? Its initial sales numbers brought about multiple evolutions through its long life. Even cruiser CX models would come out, but perhaps the single craziest model came in the form of the CX500 and 650 turbos. By the 1980s in America, this bike had transformed into the GL500 and 650 Silverwings, kind of the goofy but useful baby brothers to the Goldwing. The Goldwing, though, was still Honda's big touring cash cow in America, slowly eating away at Harley's domestic sales. Harley's struggles would prompt President Reagan's trade restrictions meant to limit the amount of motorcycles that company like Honda could export to America. Basically, there was a large tariff, some 45%, that would apply to all 700cc plus bikes. So Honda did something pretty hilarious. They turned to a motorcycle that at this point many considered kind of lame and goofy and even dated, that is the CX platform, and they threw a turbo on it with turbo stickers literally everywhere. Enter the CX500 and 650 Turbo. In 650 form, it now made almost 100 horsepower, and it was more reliable, easier to use, and better for serious riding in pretty much every single way than any large capacity tourer to come out of Milwaukee. The CXTs or turbos would bring about a kind of odd and very short golden era of production turbo motorcycles. In the end, Japanese turbocharged motorcycles never quite performed as intended. They were heavy and expensive and somewhat unpredictable, but they were still better than what Harley had to offer. But the future of high-powered sport bikes wouldn't end up being turbos. It would just come from, good old traditional methods like higher revs and higher compression and lightweight materials. Despite existing as a great model range for the company, the slogan "first into the future" wouldn't quite prove true for Honda's strange, liquid-cooled V-twin. To me, the legacy of Honda's odd CX line is really just their ability to play a different game than everyone else. Instead of trying to compete directly with Yamaha and Kawasaki and Suzuki's, 500cc models from the time, and, focus mainly on specs and making pretty much the same motorcycles, Honda tried to look beyond the simple horsepower and spec sheet war to really capture what riders would want, sometimes even before riders knew that they wanted it. And in some ways they would prove to be right, and in others not so much. Regardless, the CX stands as a symbol of Honda's willingness to experiment and often execute brilliantly with all new motorcycles that really would stand the test of time, not only in performance but also reliability. As middleweights once again find themselves dominating the market, and as everybody once again seems to kind of be copying each other's designs, I wonder what company will take a lesson out of Honda's playbook and make something entirely different and new for this class today. Or you could just say screw all that and go get an old CX. It'll do everything pretty much just as good as any motorcycle, especially the turbo form. It'll do pretty much most things just as good as a modern middleweight. The CX would go down as a cult classic with its bold late 70s and eventually 80s styling, its weird engine, and ultimately fantastic performance and reliability. So if you can find yourself an old CX in decent shape, you'll have yourself a great, trusty motorcycle, there's no denying that, and you'll join a long line of weird but dedicated riders who do understand what makes a great bike. If you've been or are one of those CX weirdos, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Thanks for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.